EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. So we have a choice. I can say good morning and there'll be a little bit of a lackluster response, or I can say good morning and everybody says good morning in a nice loud voice and doesn't make me do it again. I prefer the former. So good morning.
Good morning.
Hey, there we go. Hi, everybody. We're going to jump into our session in just a moment, but I wanted to just sort of set the stage for you a little bit. Before I joined EWA, I was a beat reporter in Las Vegas. And early in my career there, I wrote about a school where more than 90% of the students met the federal definition for homelessness. And the school's principal and teachers were taking extraordinary steps to meet the students' basic needs. After my story ran, there was a surge of response from the community. A couple of dentists called up the school to offer some pro bono services, and the principal told them, you know what, actually, the mobile clinic from the State University's dental school was actually at the campus that week. The dentist asked, what else can we do for you? And the principal said, well, our kids really need shoes. So the teachers wrote down the sizes of all the students in the classrooms, gave the list to the office manager, and she and the dentist went shopping. They cleaned out TJ Maxx, Marshalls, Neiman Rack, all of the kids' sneakers. A few days later, there were new shoes in every kid's cubby. But then something unexpected happened. A lot of the shoes didn't fit. Anyone in the audience have a guess why that might have been? Well, it was a surprise to the teacher and the principal, who knew those students pretty well, but many of them had borrowed the shoes that they wore that day to school. They'd either been given to them by somebody at the shelter, they were in a pile by the front door of the house where they were staying, or they belonged to a sibling. When the dentist found out about this, they helped the principal find a nonprofit group that sent out a team of shoe salesmen with a trailer of brand new shoes, and they measured and fit the kids again, and it worked. This was a huge lesson for me as an education journalist on multiple fronts. Having dentists with high-limit credit cards in line with you at TJ Maxx is all well and good, but it's not going to meaningfully address systemic inequities. Addressing the impact of concentrated poverty on schools, students, and families requires much more than good intentions. That's what we're going to talk about here, how some states are rethinking their approach to education funding with an eye toward more equitably and effectively addressing concentrated poverty. What is the impact on students? Why do these schools need additional resources? And how can we get more students the supports that are most likely to make a meaningful difference in their educational outcomes and their lives? We've got 3 experts here to talk about it. Lots of ground to cover, so we're going to jump right in. I want to reassure you we are going to leave time for your questions. So first up, joining us in the middle, we have John Affeldt. He's a managing attorney at Public Advocates, where he works on educational equity issues. He has also helped to shape several provisions of California's local control funding formula, now in its 10th year. Amber Arellano is the executive director of the Education Trust Midwest. The organization advocated for recent changes to Michigan's school funding formula. And Ericka Weathers, to my right, is an assistant professor of education at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on K-12 educational inequality and education policy. Ericka, I want to start with you and give our audience a little bit of grounding in what we know. What does the research tell us about economic segregation and resulting concentrations of poverty?
Yeah. Can everyone hear me? Yes. So the literature tells us that concentrated poverty exists for a number of reasons, right? It's not just one factor, but it's sort of a coalescing of factors that come together, such as an ever-changing economy, economic segregation, and racial segregation. There's not a consensus on what factor particularly matters more, but think of them as sort of all working together to create these conditions for concentrated poverty. And the reason why concentrated poverty is a concern because it compounds the challenges that people in poverty face. There's some work by Dragowski who basically calls this a double burden of sorts, where people who are economically disadvantaged live in communities with high rates of economic disadvantage. So for example, a child might struggle in school because their family is poor. And so at home, maybe they have increased responsibilities, they have limited access to resources, maybe they're food insecure. But if that same kid is in an environment of concentrated poverty, those issues are exacerbated. The communities lack resources that are needed. So, right, there may be, lack of access to quality health care, there may be food deserts, and things of that nature. And so concentrated poverty is not just oh, this family is in poverty. It's a community of poverty, and it basically just doubles the burdens. And so growing up in disadvantaged communities or concentrated poverty, the literature shows that it can hinder educational outcomes, occupational health, and economic advancement or mobility. Concentrated poverty can decrease the odds from graduating from school, from college. And some of the ways that the literature, maybe I won't get in there to that yet. I think that's a follow-up question, but that's just a kind of a preview of why concentrated poverty matters and the impacts that it has on students specifically.
Well, let's go ahead and ask that follow-up question. The follow-up question I have for you is there agreement among researchers around concentrated poverty, or where are the tension points that we should be aware of?
Agreement about whether concentrated poverty exists?
Well, the best way to address it.
The best way to address it. So, no. And I think if there were complete agreement, every state in the U.S. would be accounting for concentrated poverty in their funding formulas, and that's not exactly the case.
Yeah.
There's, literature that highlights when you add additional funding, either through court-ordered school finance reforms, or like you're very intentional about targeting money for high rates of poverty, that it can lead to positive results. So there's work by Ericka Johnson and Carol Jackson where they look at increases or the introduction of the provision of Head Start programming and in court-ordered school finance reforms, and how that impacts outcomes in the long run for poor students. And they find that when you sort of do these dual investments, when you start investing early to combat child poverty or concentrated poverty, and you sustain those investments over time through court-ordered school finance reforms, that it does impact student outcomes in both the short run and in the long run.
Okay. Amber, so Michigan has a new funding formula. Education Trust Midwest was a driving force in bringing together the coalition that made that happen. Can you give us the elevator pitch on what's changed? What does the new formula do?
Sure. So for those of you who aren't not familiar with funding formulas that consider for concentration of poverty, in Michigan and Massachusetts as well, the new structure is one that not only do districts get more dollars for their students who are low-income students, but we actually now have what's called an opportunity index, which considers for the concentration of poverty in which a child lives. So we have 6 bands now. This was just passed in June of 2023. There are 6 bands, and for each band, there's a different percentage weight that a low-income student gets. In addition to, additional funding on top of the foundation allowance that every district gets in the state for each child. And so the higher band of poverty, or the higher band in the opportunity index, the higher the weight is for that student. And so in Michigan, we were such a low spending state. We did an analysis a few years ago that actually found that compared to other states with similar funding formulas, we have at one time we had one of the lowest weights for low-income students in the country. And so now in Michigan, if you live in one of the highest bands for poverty, it's more than 4 times. That's the long-term goal. It's more than 4 times the weight than it was previously, which is frankly like pretty. We were shocked, frankly. Like we did not expect this to happen so quickly. But there was just sometimes these things happen, the political will. We had been working toward it for about 4 years. We thought we probably would need 2 or 3 more years. But there was a confluence of many things that came together, and it came together. But I just want to build on something that Ericka said about thinking about the differences in communities in terms of concentration of poverty, and just like connecting to that to school districts. If you think about the difference between a low-income students in a very, very poor community, say as Flint, Michigan, compared to say like a very affluent suburb, the differences in that those districts have in terms of capacity are so dramatic. They're so dramatic, right? The difference in an affluent community and having the capacity to support a low-income student is so different. And so that's what our funding formula is really trying to take in consideration for now.
Thank you, Ember. John, so it's been 10 years since California adopted the local control funding formula, and it provides additional funding for the concentrated poverty that we're talking about. So you're, forgive me, the old hand here on stage when it comes to the actual implications of this. If somebody can think of a better phrase than that, let me know. I'll be happy to use it. So can you talk to us a little bit about what the impact has been for California in the past decade?
Well, first of all, the conversation has changed. And now it is a given that equity must be at the center of our educational enterprise. And the funding formula does center students with the least advantage. And as Governor Brown said at the time when he was pushing this, to treat unequal children equally is not justice. And I think it has been an important refocusing on making sure we're doing more for students who need the most. And the impact has been significant. Money has flowed more progressively to districts where there is more poverty, and the outcomes are coming forth. The Rucker-Johnson study that Ericka mentioned found significant positive effects: growth in reading and math, reduction in suspensions and expulsions, a reduction in grade retention, increase in grad rates, increase in college readiness across every school that was looked at that has more money, and more and better results, particularly where schools were getting the concentration grant for extended poverty. And just briefly, we have a base grant. Every low-income student or English learner or foster youth, we'll call them high-need student, gets 20% more, the district gets, and the district gets 50% more. Actually, it was 50%. The Rucker-Johnson study, it was 50%. Since then, during the pandemic, we changed that to 65%. So for every student, 55% or greater, the district gets 65% on top of the base. So that's how we fund our concentrated poverty. And in those concentration schools in particular, we have seen real gains.
So, Ericka, you had mentioned Rucker-Johnson at UC Berkeley, and he did look at California's local control funding formula, and he found for the school years between 2013 and 2019 that there were improvements, as John just said, across these grade spectrums, and they were remarkable. But California also changed some of its other policies during that time period. For example, they got rid of their exit exam for high school students, and there were other factors that may have influenced some of those metrics or outcomes. So as for education journalists, how do we sort of tease that out or bring a skeptical lens to claims that this is working? Is there a way to say it was the funding formula that did it versus maybe some other policies?
Yeah, so it's starting with the research, right? Pointing to credible, rigorous research, and so Rucker-Johnson's work rules out a lot of those other things, right? In pinpointing that it's the school funding formula. There's other work by people like, and it's not necessarily in California, but Chris Candelaria and Kenneth Shores, Sean Schimbach and La Fortune, who look at sort of improvements in academic outcomes because of increased funding, because of court-ordered school finance reforms. But the other part of it is, I don't know that we should shy away from talking about the other stuff. As I talked about when I first started talking about Rucker-Johnson's work, and I talked about sort of simultaneously doing these things together matters, right? It's not like one solution is going to fix the problem. And so yes, funding, of course, but let's talk about ending exit exams. I think during that same time period, California also ended suspensions for willful defiance, which basically, sort of more subjective interpretations of behavioral infractions, which was disproportionately impacting students of color. And they ended it not for everyone, but I think in the earlier grades, right? And so basically I'm arguing, find the good research. Rucker-Johnson is doing really great research, but also don't be afraid to bring up some of the other changes that have happened as well, because it's a policy environment and not one single thing just matters.
So, Amber, these kinds of funding formula changes can turn into hugely divisive and politicized battles. And how did advocates get this done in a state that is, unfortunately, as divided right now as Michigan is?
Yeah. One thing we had to do is to really do some truth-telling. As Emily knows, I was a journalist for a long time, and so we thought a lot about, how do we inform the conversation with facts and data? And our team did a lot of work with support from our national office on how do we help provide some more context for Michiganders on this. So many people did not know that we did have such low weights for low-income students compared to states with similar systems. And it was sort of amazing to see the turn in public opinion among lots of stakeholders when we began to inform that conversation and shape that conversation with that data. Two, we had to really think about dispelling myths. I think there's a myth that when we invest more in equitable funding, that large urban areas and frankly communities that are predominantly Black and Latino will entirely benefit or will be the only folks that benefit, and that's simply not true. We've been doing lots of analyses that will show, and we're going to be releasing more of this in May, that show actually that some of the areas that are the biggest winners under the new student school funding formula in Michigan are white rural areas. And working class suburbs are big beneficiaries, small towns are big beneficiaries. This cuts across class, it cuts across race, it's every geographic region benefits from when we invest in equity. So that was really, really important to build a bipartisan coalition. That was the last thing. We had, Michigan is a very purple state like much of the Midwest. Michigan went for Obama, then it went for Trump, then it went for Biden. Our state legislature often goes back and forth really quickly, and even when one party is in power, the voting margins are so tight that whatever party's in power, they typically have to have a little bit of support from the other side of the aisle. And that was true with this funding formula change last year, although Democrats were in control last year. We still needed some support from Republicans, and we did get that. It was a bipartisan package, and I'd like to think that our coalition, the Michigan Partnership for Equity and Opportunity, played a factor in that. We built a business civil rights coalition, which is unusual in our state. We tend to be, like many states, very divided by race and class and geography, and certainly by partisan politics. And we have very conservative Republicans in our coalition, corporate leaders, civil rights leaders. We have a wonderful leader, Mike Giandernoa, very respected Republican donor, corporate leader in our state, and Alice Thompson, key education leader with the Detroit NAACP, really considered to be the matriarch of the modern civil rights movement in Michigan. They are two of our tri-chairs along with me. And so, Mike and Alice don't agree on everything, certainly, but they're both passionate about equity, as are the leaders across the state involved in this coalition. And with, when you have that kind of leadership, engaging both sides of the aisle, engaging stakeholders across the state, it was really important that, all kinds of folks could see themselves in our coalition, and they could see that lots of people were going to benefit. It wasn't just for one group of kids. It wasn't just for one type of community.
John, I'm curious, were there any surprising allies for California when you were working on rolling this out? Did anybody come out and join? Because I do think you're right, it sort of gets labeled as maybe this liberal idea, and there's certainly plenty of fiscal conservatives who think this is the way to go.
I can think of one. For the most part, no. The suburbs, the suburban districts, which were both Democrat and Republican, were not particularly pleased with the governor's proposal for this initially, and it failed the first time around when it went out in 2012. But I would say I could talk about the politics of how we pushed it through, but I think it was a lot of leadership from Jerry Brown, in combination with a lot of moral authority coming from community organizations and equity and civil rights advocates, saying that we needed this. Who were quite informed about the disparities and inequities in the system, and that really did, carry the day in that sense. Maybe the somewhat surprising bedfellow and winners were charter schools and the charter community. Governor Brown is a big proponent of charters, and alongside the one of the changes was charter schools got more funding. They got treated like regular districts, and they were, sort of getting less funding than the average district student would be. So this rationalized the system for charters too, and there was a lot of support from the Republican as well as Democrat charter community.
Have you won over anybody? Has anybody come to you and said, 10 years out, hey, I was wrong, or is that asking for too much?
Oh, I think it's more acceptance that this is the new system and this is the way it's going to be. And the administration and Department of Finance worked hard so that the districts weren't losers. They were just growing more slowly. And the thing that made it happen and possible in 2013, where it had not worked the year before, was Governor Brown went out with our community partners and pushed for Prop 30, which raised taxes mostly on the wealthy. There was also sales tax. And that brought in enough new funding, this is sort of post-recession, that all of a sudden it was possible to envision an implementation where districts were held harmless, and that the 7-year sort of ramp up to full funding, the districts with concentrated poverty would just grow at a much faster rate, and that's how it's worked.
Ericka, is it enough to talk about economic segregation? Should we also be talking about racial segregation as a factor here, or even a multiplier in some of these outcomes and equations for students?
Yeah, so some of my own work, some of Bruce Baker, Preston Green, out of the Albert Shanker Institute work would suggest that we need to. So I have work that looks at the relationship between segregation between school districts and racial disparities and school revenue and school expenditure. So racial disparities meaning sort of Black-white disparities and Latinx-white disparities. And what we find is that as racial segregation increases between districts in a given state, these revenue and expenditure disparities, particularly for total revenue and local revenue, shift in a way that disfavors the typical Black students district. And this is even after we account for what we call economic segregation or racialized economic segregation. And so that says, it's a descriptive paper, but there's other work also by Bruce Baker that shows sort of the same thing, where they're looking at metropolitan segregation, and they have like 7 case studies. Hartford, Connecticut, where I'm from, is one of those places. And it's not enough. And so basically state and federal funding, which is designed to be compensatory and, amidst sort of local revenue shortfalls or to account for factors like poverty and English language learning and things of that nature, it's not enough. So I would argue, what does it mean to consider racial segregation? Because racial segregation didn't come about randomly, right? We've, have a history of centuries of racially discriminatory practices, and even though it's not legal anymore, the effects of that still linger. The same paper by Bruce Baker looks at the impacts of redlining and how that still shows up today, and that still shows up today. And so how can we intentionally say, okay, yes, economic segregation is a problem and it matters, but it's also related to racial segregation. And how do we address racial inequality if we're not directly thinking about solutions that target racial segregation or histories of racially discriminatory practices? That's my take.
So, Amber, these kinds of campaigns take a long time, and obviously yours was interrupted, for lack of a better word, by the pandemic. And I'm wondering how that impacted your organization and the coalition's thinking about what students needed most. Did it change anything for you?
Yeah, sure. The truth is that we had hoped to build an opportunity index that, frankly, was much more expansive and that would drive more investment into the schools and districts with the highest concentration of poverty. The research shows that students who live in highest concentrations of poverty should have a weight as much as 100% or even 150% or more. And so on one hand, it's a big political win to get the commitment that we did in statute in Michigan at 47%, but it's not nearly enough. And so I think, if anything, the pandemic just sort of reinforced that the urgency for more capacity for these very, very high poverty districts was so desperately needed, and it's still needed, right? I mean, students across the country are behind, and this is particularly true for different subgroups of students. So I think the pandemic was an opportunity for us to rethink our strategy, though. There had been a lot of conversation about reimagining Michigan's school funding system, and being equity advocates, that was a tough conversation for us. Like, we did not feel like we were really making much headway or being heard in some of that conversation. And so the pandemic gave us a chance to sort of pause and rethink and really kind of rapidly expand our coalition, which is eventually what made the effort successful.
A lot of states are obviously looking to California for inspiration, and I'm wondering, John, if you look back at what you know now that you didn't know then, that you would hope people who are thinking about an approach to concentrated poverty like this, what are some lessons they can take away from California's experience?
Well, I do think it's important on the political front to realize this is a multi-year battle, and you really do have to build up your forces to support this and push this through. It's a political battle, first and foremost. We were fortunate to have a governor who came in with a very astute advisor in Mike Kearse, Professor Mike Kearse out of Stanford, who had been his state board chair his first 8 years as governor in the 70s and early 80s, and he made Mike his state board chair for his second 8 years as governor. But school funding was one of Mike's specialties, and it was part of his campaign platform, Brown's, to reform our system. And so I think in California we had a research community or foundations that supported our researchers to do a series of studies for the state. Among which was Mike's talking about school funding, the need for reform. But the foundations also supported groups like ours and community-based organizations so that we were able to, we sued the state in 2010 for an inadequate, unconstitutional school funding system, which we didn't prevail on that, but a lot of those ideas infused LCFF. And most importantly, the organizers and the communities were very knowledgeable and informed about school finance and the inequities by 2013, so that when it came time to go to the Capitol and talk to legislators and talk to the administration, monolingual Spanish-speaking moms were able to stand toe-to-toe with the governor's staff and say, no, you gotta have this or that aspect of the system. And when it came time to is this going to happen or not, the suburbs are pushing back. The administration came to us and said, all right, we need you guys to, what more do you need in here? Because we need your voice pushing this over So I think that having that infrastructure, enabled us to build the political will. And I should not exclude the journalists, and because the foundations are funding places like EdSource in California, and John Fensterwald is a treasure of having 20, 30 years of ability to kind of convey to the policymakers, because they read it. I know the governor reads EdSource, and Cal Matters and these other sort of education blogs. That's been a key part of the ongoing conversation that we've been fortunate to have in California.
Ericka, you get a lot of calls from reporters on this topic, and honestly, for some of us, this is very complex. School finance may not be our specialty or area. What advice do you have for a reporter who may be launching into this story, or some common questions that you get from reporters that you think would be good for the folks in this room to have a grounding about?
Oh, that's a really good question. Try not to go down the rabbit hole of the weeds of understanding the nuts and bolts of school funding. I think trying to locate sources of information that are really good primers, right? But I don't think the details are in the meat is in the details of the funding formulas and all of that. But really thinking about the questions I get a lot are like, sort of, what are the implications of this? Why does this matter? What's being done about it, and continuing to ask those sort of questions, I think are really helpful. Obviously, like a base level understanding of some of the school finance nuts and bolts is ideal, but really the implications, why does it matter? How did we get here? What do we do from here? I think those are the really important questions that will help sway public opinion. It will help influence, policy conversations and what's actually happening in terms of implementation.
I've got a couple of questions for the group, and then we're going to turn to your questions out there in this very lovely audience here at South by Southwest EDU, so you want to start getting those ready. So when additional dollars flow through the state formula, it's up to local districts to incorporate them into their budgets. So I'd like to ask an accountability question. How do you balance making sure the funds are directed to the students who need them most while still giving districts some element of local control?
Well, that's something I've spent a lot of my career working on. But the short answer is the way we did in California was the supplemental and concentration grants for high-need students. The statute said must be used to increase or improve services for those students in proportion to the amount of funding they got. And we wrote regulations, and that was a big battle, and we turned out hundreds at the state board to push back on their weak regulations. We won decent regulations that basically have a loose hand. It's not as tight as a categorical, bean counting system, and this money is spent on this kid and not on that kid. But it is, I would say, a loose hand of the district has to explain in their local plans and include community groups in creating those plans, and how they are first and foremost thinking about high-need students with the use of those funds. So a lot of it can be spent district-wide. You can't do that with Title I. You could have a district-wide professional development program for English learners. You could have, maybe, if you really could show that's what you needed next, a salary increase for to attract and retain teachers in your highest need schools. You could maybe do that. So that's what the regs say, principally directed. First and foremost, you're thinking about the high need students. And secondly, and we're still just starting to implement the second part, the funds have to be effective. So there's a back end analysis of it. Did it work? Did that salary increase work? Because if it didn't, then you got to use your base funds for that, and you got to find another use for your supplemental concentration. So that's what we've done. The other thing I'll say real quickly, there was leakage because districts were folding unused funds into the general funds the following year. And we were losing, I estimated, $3 billion a year, about a third or a fourth of our supplemental.
$3 billion?
Well, yeah, we have $12 billion in supplemental and concentration funds in the state. It's a lot of money. It's a big state. It's a big reform. But I'm guessing we were losing 25, 33% of money that didn't get used up and just kind of got folded in. So we worked on that one for years. We got a good state auditor report that used our complaints that we had filed to say this stuff's not being used properly. And we helped rewrite the rules to capture the carryover. The districts now have to track. If you didn't use it all, if you didn't, proportionally meet those services at a higher level, then it gets quantified and added to next year's supplemental concentration. So those are some of the ways that we've tried to tighten the hatches, not too tight, but enough to let local innovation happen, but still proportional accountability.
So Amber, I'd like to ask you the same question. Where do you strike that balance between guardrails and handcuffs, if you will, and giving districts flexibility while still holding them accountable?
Yeah, I mean, we're not, we haven't even begun a conversation about fiscal accountability and transparency yet in Michigan. And I think the great work in California, but also sort of the lessons learned from California show that, if anything, they're just, it's not, there's not been an overdoing of accountability in terms of the dollars. It's been so loose. And just to John's point about one of those state reports out of California, there was one report that found for the additional dollars for low-income students, as much as half weren't reaching their own schools. We're talking about billions of dollars, right, not reaching vulnerable students. And you think about the impact that those dollars could have made, right, if they would have reached them. So this is not, I would say California actually had thought about that, though, and actually put a plan in place. It might not have been perfect, but we haven't even gotten to that yet. And so I think this is a really important role for journalists to shed a spotlight on this. Right, it's hard enough to do systems change and funding formulas that are equity oriented, but putting these kinds of systems in, ability to track dollars, oversight mechanisms. You were talking about, like, on the back end, trying to figure out some evaluative mechanism, right, to actually see like what the impact has been. That's even harder to do. And so without, I think, that kind of coverage and journalists really asking those kinds of questions, I don't know that I think journalists play an essential role in shaping conversations and informing conversations, and asking tough questions of political leaders about that.
Ericka, when it comes to these kinds of policies and changes, for a lot of people, to quote Carrie Fisher, instant gratification takes too long. What is a reasonable timeline or expectation to start writing those stories about, is this working? Is this a success?
There isn't, because it's going to be different everywhere. Mm-hmm. I think about something happens, a policy is passed, it's enacted. Is it enacted right away? Is it enacted with fidelity? And I think answering some of those questions matter as well. And so, right, has it been a couple of years? What outcomes are you measuring, right? Are you looking at outcomes that might be really hard to change, like test scores? Like, that's going to take a while. Adding more funding in 1 year and then saying by next year, these students should all be academically proficient in reading and math. The literature will tell you that that's not exactly true, right? But if there are like shorter term outcomes, like could adding more funding to provide more school counselors who are going to help address needs of student attendance, and then you're going to, measure, whether students are showing up more. That might be a more realistic outcome to measure in the short term. So I think it's not a clear answer. It's sort of getting realistic about policy enactment, implementation. Was it done with fidelity? What are the outcomes that you're interested in? Sort of what does the literature say about when you should be measuring those? So yeah.
Really interesting. When I think back to some of past programs, things like the 21st Century Learning Centers, which a lot of people may remember, and the idea behind those were you were going to give high-need communities seed money, and it would grow, but it was finite, right? And the community was supposed to take over. In the states that you look at where you see this working as a success, is there some growth around those schools to support and encourage them and help them? Is there more buy-in from the community as a result of this money? Is it helping to grow community engagement, family engagement?
You're specifically talking about funding for community schools?
Yeah.
I actually am not confident answering that question
Sure.
in terms of the outcomes. Maybe someone else might be able to speak with that.
Well, I'm wondering if that's one of the things that may come from tackling concentrated poverty. So, for example, it's not just money going to the schools, but is there any kind of a sense or idea that it's also going to grow support within the community for that school?
In theory, yes, but I also think it's a dangerous assumption. I think we have to be careful because you give dollars for this particular thing and it's finite, right?
Yeah.
But what happens if they can't sustain it, they can't get the funding, or there isn't the community buy-in, then what, right? Then we start from scratch. So I don't have a I don't have a solid answer.
Well, that's
for
why I
that.
think the concentrated poverty formula is maybe better, right? And so that's where I'm interested is, to me, it just sounds like common sense, right? I'm not sure what's not common sense about giving the schools with the highest needs kids the most money. So can you be devil's advocate? What's the argument against this, and what would work better or differently?
So yeah, so now when you frame it that way, it makes a lot of sense. So I think it's the arguments against it's political. I think it's a debate of the age-old question of does money matter, and how does it matter? I think is one of the biggest reasons why we see that divide. There's what the Eric Hanushek era of literature, and then there's more literature today by folks like Rutger Johnson, Carabo Jackson, some of the people that I mentioned, right? And how do we sort of get on the same page about what that means for kids? But I would agree that a more long-term investment and not sort of these piecemeal community schools here, you get a community school, you get a community school, and then you don't. What does it mean to actually have a policy in place where there's guaranteed funding over time for concentrated poverty?
In many states, I wish it was a debate about research, but it's often not. There's really very little attention given to research, and it's really about tradition. And the tradition is, this idea that everybody should get the same. There's with no accounting for need. The politics are also really important. Wealthy school districts often have a lot, they have more resources to lobby. And so their voices are often heard the most in state capitals. That was certainly true in Michigan for decades. And so there's just a huge incentive and a political return, right? If you're putting just as much money in a wealthy suburb, that you're going to get some political ROI on versus in communities of higher need. And I think what was been important where we've been working is helping folks understand that, like, what was the kind of the conventional wisdom, or what has been the tradition for decades, is actually not only is it not best practice, but lots of other states don't do that, right? That we're so behind, and behind California, behind Maryland, behind Massachusetts, behind Tennessee, and so that's good, right? And again, giving context, and I think journalists are so important in this for local stakeholders when things have been sort of so normalized, but it's actually not. It's really, there are lots of things that are practices that are done because it's always been done this way, right? It's been done for 20 or 30 years, but the truth is that it's probably like 30 years out of date too. And so journalists can really help inform and illuminate that, right, and provide that national context.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't mention California's $4.3 billion investment in community schools, which I think is the biggest investment nationally in the country. We're just still getting that off the ground, but the Newsom administration has made that investment, and TK, and behavioral mental health, and a number of other initiatives, many of which are on the chopping block, but maybe. But that's an important thing for journalists to look at in California, is like, how is that working? Because that is the idea, is to transform from the bottom up and really bring in the community. The other response to your question about what's another way to address concentrated poverty is not to send the money to those schools, but to deconcentrate the poverty. And that requires a real radical rethinking of district boundaries. And they're not set in stone. Maybe we should have county-wide districts like Florida does, and much more economic integration across the lines. That's just one example. But the research is quite strong that the best way to improve results for low-income children is to put them in schools with not low-income children, where those other assets that we talked about earlier exist.
Well, I mean, when people say to me, have you ever seen arguments come down at school board meetings like we've seen the last couple of years, and I feel like saying to them, have you ever been to a school zoning meeting? I mean, have you ever sat there in the audience when you try to tell a parent your kid's going to go to a different school? Ericka, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I wanted to piggyback off of the information, the politics, and the research. And I think this is where it becomes important, Amber, too, is and for journalists as well, so that people who have been stuck in their ways for a really long time, how do we put new information and new research in front of them? How do we remove them from sort of old ways of thinking? And I think some of that is new information. And I think I'm probably biased because I'm a researcher, and I really believe in the power of research. If people pay attention and if we make research accessible, that's one of the reasons why I do things like this. But I definitely think that matters. And I wanted to actually tie on the point too of it's also it's a framing, right, too. It's sort of in research we talk about sort of theory, but we talk about the social construction of a target population, right? So who's going to benefit from these policies? And I think for years it's always been about doing this is going to benefit poor kids. But let's have conversations as journalists and as society about what's the larger benefit and who's the larger benefit for, because it's not just, poor kids. Society as a whole benefits when our students are strong collectively. And why don't we do more to frame it that way as well?
And we've certainly seen, reports and studies that come out when we talk about, for example, having more diverse teacher workforce. And people talk about that it's better for children of color to have a diverse teacher, but that it also improves test scores for white students. And I'm wondering, is there a framing here that we should be careful of when making those assumptions that you talk about the larger society, but has there been anything that you can share for us about sort of the collective benefit to the classroom for the wealthy kids who are maybe in the room with the kids of concentrated poverty?
So I've seen some research. It's an intersection of racial segregation and economic segregation, but there's some literature, and I can't remember the scholar's name, so please forgive me. I can probably find it after. But one thing that they found is that when white students are in schools that are more economically and racially diverse, it matters for civic engagement later. It matters for how they're participating in society and in government and sort of democracy, if we say that's something that we care about. And so I think that's one example of a collective benefit, that it's not just for students of color.
I'm delighted to say that we've got journalists lined up at the microphone. So I'm going to ask you, and maybe some non-journalists too, which is fine. So can you just make sure to tell us your name and where you're from, and go ahead with your question.
I'm Kimberly Robinson. I'm a law professor at the University of Virginia School of Law and director of the Education Rights Institute. So my question is actually twofold. So one, we've heard a lot from the panelists about the politics that sort of helped to bring about school finance reform. And I'm interested in the role that rights played, since all 50 states have a right to education, but unsuccessful litigation in California and Michigan. I'm interested in how the recognition of a state right to education played a role in getting some reform or not. And then second, I'm sort of interested in just the thoughts of the panelists on litigation as a continued tool for moving forward this issue of addressing the needs of students in concentrated poverty. Because if you look at like Kirabo Jackson's research, he studied sort of a lot of the positive school changes that happen in school funding formulas as a result of successful litigation. So I'm interested in your thoughts about litigation as a continued tool. Is it sort of, not as useful? Is it really just come down to the politics? Like, I'm sort of interested in your thoughts about that. Thank you.
That was not a big factor. I mean, it really wasn't a factor in our funding change, unfortunately. But there are states that has made a difference, and hopefully Eric can speak to those. But I mean, if that makes sense in your state, if that's a good route, smart, go for it. That just was not, and there has been litigation in Michigan. It just was not considered to be particularly impactful for changing funding in our state.
Yeah, I think it's, as a lawyer, I have to say this, it's an important tool in the arsenal to move the conversation along, right? And California does have, it was a public advocates case in the 70s, before my time, that established education is a fundamental right under our state constitution, and that there should be basic equality of educational opportunity. We tried to build on that with our school funding case to say there should be a minimum level of support from the state, a minimum level of quality, and the Court of Appeals disagreed 2-1 with us and said that's for the legislature to decide. And while that was on appeal, LCFF happened, and we appealed to the Supreme Court, and we lost by 1 vote. That case getting taken up. I think in large part because LCFF had happened, and the court was like, well, let's see how this goes and come back, if it doesn't do enough. So it's still in play in California for us, but I think it is an important tool. Jerry Brown and Mike Hurst would have done it anyway, I think, without our lawsuit. But as I said earlier, I think the lawsuit both informed LCFF, and it also helped build the base that helped the political conversation when it came time.
Great. So next question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Perlmutter, and I lead fundraising for our Public Education Foundation and Austin ISD. And I'm curious, for the districts that have received the additional funding and are seeing different student outcomes, what are they spending the money on that has been most effective? Just speaking as somebody who may just need a fundraise, since Texas is probably not going to add additional funding. So what are you seeing that's effective since you've had this beautiful experiment in California?
Quickly, I just go on Rutgers Johnson's research. Teacher compensation, teacher retention, and class size reduction, he found were the most effective uses that contributed to the improvements in test scores.
Great question.
Hi, my name is Tricia Crane, and I write for Alabama Education Lab in Alabama. So my question is this: one of the we have areas like the Black Belt area of Alabama that just don't have resources, that just don't have the community infrastructure to be able to use the extra money. We found this with ESSER money, COVID pandemic relief. So again, as part of, your experience, have you found that, a lot of our lawmakers say, build it and they will come, right? Like we'll put the money into the community and the market will pull these services into the community. Are you seeing that at all? In these real deserts, where there's just nothing there.
So, I hear you on the ESSER dollars, and many districts struggle to spend, especially with the anticipation of the money disappearing. And that makes sense. And if you think about what's happened in California with districts investing in teacher compensation, building teachers' capacity, improving turnover, they knew that by doing those things, they were going to be able to keep that up. And so I think we're not seeing the way that Michigan is doing this is by bit building year by year by year up to these goals that we've set. So I don't think it will. So far, we're not seeing that. If anything, high poverty districts are saying, "Great, but we need way more," right? And they want to make sure that those dollars will stay there. And I think one of the promises of California is that the districts knew that the money was going to be there. And I think that's the difference, right? If your ability to hire is so different if you're like, okay, I've got this money for 2 years versus like, wow, I'm going to be able to hire 10 teachers forever, right? And I'm going to be able to boost salaries and close, which can be significant teacher salary gaps between affluent districts and high poverty districts. I'm going to be able to address those forever, right? I'm going to be able to reduce class size 3-8 forever. At least for the next 2 to 3 decades, right? That's a really big difference as a principal, as a district leader, and so I hear what you're saying, but I think it's such a different decision matrix for those leaders.
We have time for just a couple more questions, so we're going to try to keep them tight.
Hi, I'm Candace from Detroit. I work for Detroit Public Schools. Go Michigan.
Ooh, go blue.
Go blue.
Go Detroit?
Yes. So I believe what I noted here was that we were talking about racial segregation in school districts and how where there is racial segregation, there tends to be a discrepancy in revenue and spending in those districts, such that even with policies where federal and state funding are supposed to be addressing, our high population of ESL students and our impoverished students, that is still not enough, and therefore seeking to desegregate school districts would actually be more effective. I'm wondering if you can speak more to the implications of those discrepancies of spending in highly segregated districts. What are the implications there? What's happening financially that is seems to be a result of those districts being segregated, if that makes sense what I'm asking.
I think that's good for Ericka.
Yeah, and so I don't have a definitive answer because my data don't allow me to sort of dig into the nitty-gritty of what each districts are doing. But some of the implications that I talk about and things that we should be thinking about in the research that I write is, our research shows that it's really at the local level, right, where this funding disparity is happening. And so can we think strategically as policymakers, as communities, about what's happening at the local level that could be related to race, right? There's nothing in funding formulas or funding policies that says allocate money based on race, right? But why do we see this? Again, it's this descriptive relationships. It's not causal. It's not saying that racial segregation causes funding disparities, but they're trending together. So as racial segregation increases, these funding disparities widen. And so some of the things that I think about, in a given state, school districts can be either fiscally independent or fiscally dependent, right? And if you're fiscally dependent, that means you're relying on a higher level of government to authorize levying taxes, right? If you're fiscally independent, you can make some of those decisions yourselves, right? And so it's some of what we're seeing in sort of some of those policy decision makings where we're not necessarily related to a funding formula, but are related to decision making. I lived in I won't say the city or the state. I lived in a place where we evaluated this program for schools, and the program for schools relied on funding from a tax levy every 7 years. And every 7 years, that tax levy barely passed. And so what does it mean to get additional funding from a tax levy that's going to help fund programs or schooling stuff for, marginalized communities versus not? So I just think of just interrogating local policies and practices as a way to try to get at what could be happening.
So I want to make sure we get to some story ideas for reporters. So while this last question is being asked, I'd like to ask the panelists to be thinking in one sentence a story idea that you'd like education journalists to be covering around these topics. And you get the last question, sir.
Great, thanks. Hi, Alex Schub from School Empowerment Network. My question is about the strategy or the decision to tie funding to district-wide percentages, if I'm understanding correctly, instead of tying it directly to students and having it follow the students. And I'm asking, based on the context of a school I founded as the principal, we were 100% free and reduced lunch, Title I eligible. The school's been very successful. The neighborhood is also gentrified. They're now on the cusp of losing Title I funding because they're about to cross below the threshold of the percentage of kids that make you eligible. Yeah. But it's not like the 62% instead of the 63% of kids no longer need that extra support. So why the decision, and are there good reasons for that?
Yeah, in California, the powers that be were very clear. They wanted the money to go to the district and support district local control. School boards are the mechanism that makes the district level decision. Going down to school level, we fought a lot about, we tried to get money committed to school or certain percentage, and we weren't successful. It gets a little too close to vouchers, I think, politically, that money's following the kid, and then it's like, and they can leave the public school system too now. So that's the politics of how we ended up there. Yeah. You want me to go into my question for
No,
journalists?
I think that probably will wrap that one up. So quickly, Amber, a story idea for education journalists in the room.
Okay, I have two. I'll be really quick. Former journalist here. One is if you're interested in this topic and you want to dig in, and your state hasn't done funding reform, I would suggest looking at what your weights are for your low-income students and how they compare to states with similar funding formulas. And call us if you need some tips on how to do that. But it doesn't have to be a year-long study. You can actually, a journalist could do this. So, and I think context is really important to inform readers on how your state is doing in supporting low-income students. And then secondly, I think a lot of folks don't understand the connections. Like, what is it that funding pays for? And I've often found that a lot of people think that it's simply about an after-school program, or it's programs, right? Well, the truth is that it's so deeply tied to school talent. And we know how important talent is in schools, but a lot of people don't understand that. So I would suggest helping readers understand the connection between the quality of talent, the effectiveness of talent, teacher turnover, et cetera, and funding.
Thank you so much. And John, a question from you.
I mentioned the community schools experiment, $4 billion. I'm just learning and getting into the issue of inequity in capital financing of school construction and modernization. We sent a demand letter to the state 2 weeks ago saying, you better fix this before you try to put another bond on the ballot this fall, or we may sue you. I think there's, and I think that is a problem all over the country, not just California. We're behind. The operations side, we've kind of fixed the equity, but the fiscal or the finance side of school funding is really inequitable and stuck in the 19th century. And lastly, there's a new poverty concentration factor in California called the equity multiplier that went into the budget last year. It's $300 million ongoing. It will go to the school site. It will be the most sort of lowest performing student groups, which often will be black students, special ed, et cetera. There have to be focus goals on that and community engagement around it. So I think it's another interesting California thing that is worth some investigation.
Thanks, John. And Ericka.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. It's a piggyback off of Amber's point and your question from earlier. So was it school funding that made these differences in outcomes, or was it the fact that California got rid of the exit exam? I think that was the question that you asked, right? And so it kind of goes hand in hand. What I wanted to say was interrogate that. What is money being spent on? And so did additional funding for concentrated poverty allow for some of these changes to happen? So how are districts spending the money to allow for that?
Thank you so much. A round of applause. Thank you so much for our wonderful speakers, John Affeldt, Amber Arellano, Ericka Weathers. Just a quick reminder, if you liked South by Southwest EDU, you're going to love EWA's National Seminar. We'd love to see you there. Go to EWA.org. We're going to be in Las Vegas for our 77th National Seminar. That's May 29th to June 2nd. We have scholarships available for qualified reporters, and EWA membership for journalists is free, and it's extremely reasonable for everybody else. So if you're not already a member of EWA, please join. And of course, go to your favorite podcast app and subscribe to the EWA Radio podcast. Thank you very much, everyone. And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.